Yeah, DeSantos. I don't really have a cool backstory for Cold Fear. It's just one of the games my brother and I bought when EB and GameStop was offloading their PS1 and PS2 stock for cheap, and we just kind of picked it up. I do remember attempting to play it, but I selected French language as a joke, got lost in the whaling ship, and gave up after about 15 minutes. This is the same capture situation as Lufia. I captured it using a dazzle. I don't really want to replay Cold Fear. I don't hate it by any stretch, I just don't think it's particularly good. It has decent reviews, but apparently it had abysmal sales numbers, like less than 70,000 copies across every platform it was released on. I just don't have strong feelings about Cold Fear. As such, this is probably going to be a pretty short review. I honestly don't think it's anything special, but it does do a few things that kind of make it stand out. This section includes spoilers, so skip to this timecode if you wish to avoid them. In Cold Fear, you play as Tom Hansen, a member of the US Coast Guard investigating a Russian whaling ship, the Eastern Spirit. Shortly after boarding the Eastern Spirit, Hansen hears his team members being killed over the radio. Hansen encounters frenzied Russian crew members who attack him, and he puts them down with swift American justice. As he explores the ship, Hansen finds parasitic organisms known as exocells that were discovered by the Russians working on an oil rig called the Star of Sakhalin. Is that right? Hansen ends up finding a Russian doctor who was forced by the Russian mafia to turn exocells into a biological weapon. After spilling his guts, an exocell bursts out of his chest, literally spilling his guts. Hansen also finds Anna Kamsky on the Eastern Spirit, and she is the daughter of the lead researcher for the Russians. Hansen and Anna decide to go to the oil rig because it has a cure for the exocells. Due to the rough seas, they can't actually dock the Eastern Spirit at the oil rig, so instead they decide to jump off the crow's nest. After landing, Hansen is knocked out and he is infected by an exocell. Hansen does a lot of runaround, but eventually he finds the cure. Anna says that she can fly a helicopter to escape, and then Hansen rigs up the Star of Sakhalin to explode with C4. While making final preparations to escape, a monster attacks Hansen and Anna. The monster turns out to be Dr. Kamsky, Anna's father, who has injected himself with exocell DNA and turned himself into a monster and wants to do the same to Anna. Hansen defeats the monster by shooting it right in its stupid head, and they fly away in a helicopter. Really, it's a typical story for this kind of genre. It's got some kind of Resident Evil vibes and elements with the evil doctors injecting themselves with questionable viruses, and it is remarkably similar to Resident Evil 4 with Las Plagas and the exocells being quite similar. It's fine. It's very typical as to what you'd expect from something like this. It's not bad, not great, but nothing really stands out as memorable or noteworthy. I actually had to look up a plot summary because I just didn't remember a damn thing about it. Cold Fear actually has some pretty cool ideas in terms of game mechanics. You're on the high seas on this Russian whaling ship during a storm and you're constantly fighting for footing. You'll slip and slide along the decks. You'll need to grab handrails to steady yourself to aim effectively. That was pretty cool, but I had this overwhelming feeling that it just wasn't going to last. The Russian whaling ship isn't particularly large, so a whole game taking place on that wasn't realistic. I was right. Once you finish up with the Russian whaling ship, you end up on an offshore oil rig laboratory complex. I'm okay with that, but a lot of the mechanics developed in the beginning of the game on the whaling ship just get totally dropped. You don't need to worry about sliding and falling down anymore, except in a few cases, and stabilizing yourself with handrails is basically totally removed from the equation. I don't want to say it's disappointing, but they were cool and unique mechanics, and they would have made the game stand out, and they just kind of drop it off after the first hour or so, which kind of sucks. Cold Fear is almost like arcade-like. Not in a cool, like, you shoot a ton of guys and get tons of points, blow shit up kind of way, but more in like a bare bones way. You don't have an inventory system outside of your guns. You can't bring healing items with you. There isn't really a map. This minimalism also applies to things like save points. There's no dedicated save point. You're always given the option to save before certain rooms. It's very basic in terms of mechanics. You go around the facility, you check the thing, you throw the switch, you shoot the guys, you move on to the next objective. There's a few different types of enemies, you know, there's Russian gunmen, there's infected Russians, then there's little exocells, then there's some bigger exocells, and kind of like some big juggernaut guys you fight a couple times. It's all very basic stuff, you know, you kind of know what to expect. And there's actually not a whole lot to say about it otherwise. Budget title. Even though it probably isn't one, it just felt like one. There are some cool touches, like all the writing on the whaling ship in the facility is in Russian. So what happens is you look at the writing and then Hansen translates it and you get a little subtitle at the bottom, and that's kind of cool. I will give Cold Fear and Darkworks credit. There are 3 language options. You can play in English, French, or Spanish, which is pretty cool. As far as I know, it's all fully voiced as well as with the subs, so that's kind of a nice touch. I could be wrong on that though. It's very bare bones in pretty much everything. A lot of the environments look the same. It's kind of hard to fault Cold Fear on that though, because it makes sense. A whaling ship isn't going to have a lot of diverse environments, and the same thing with an offshore oil rig. Voice acting again kind of feels like it's budget, not really up to the quality and standards that you'd expect or want. Your gun sound effects feel pretty bad. It's weak and it feels slightly delayed. I don't actually remember if it's just from the dazzle capture or if it's really like that in game, but the shooting mechanics didn't feel very good. So there are a few parts that are just kind of odd. It's very easy to die on the deck of the whaling ship and you just get swept off and killed instantly. Same thing within the facility. There are some walkways you have to cross and they often have waves that come by, and if they hit you, you get swept off and you die. There's a few others involving lasers that require some very precise movement, but otherwise it's not too bad. I respect what they tried to do with the final boss, but I think it's a mess. It took me a lot of attempts to finally get through it. In the first phase, you have to protect the girl. The boss slowly walks towards her and you need to shoot him in the back to get his attention and lead him away while avoiding him bashing you off the platform. There isn't a health bar, it's just strictly a time thing, you just gotta hold out for a little bit. A little bit seems more like a long time actually. The second phase is also the same thing, it's pretty odd. He's invincible, and you need to let him grab you and do a quick time event to shoot him in the head, and you have to do that 3 times. That's a very strange decision to me. I found it very tedious, and I died a lot because getting grabbed is quite janky, and he can still bash you off the platform. The grab also just looks like a straight up punch, so sometimes he'll grab you and sometimes he'll like hit you, and that's very strange. The first time I got there I had low life and I deemed it basically impossible to get through with red health. Then I had to revert to an older save, which you should always keep a couple saves in these kind of games. And then I went back there with full health and I still found it pretty difficult because he can just kill you so easily. And that boss fight's very long. Both phases feel like they're very, very long. Cold Fear is actually very short. My total playtime was 3 minutes short of 5 hours, and that's including replaying the final section and a lot of attempts on the final boss. There is quite a bit of backtracking, which is kind of annoying. You know, a lot of the environments look the same, so it's confusing and there's no map. It's not such a big deal on the whaling ship because it's fairly small and you kind of learn your way around because you're going back and forth a lot. I'm less enthusiastic about the oil rig. There's a lot of backtracking again, but it's more difficult because it's a lot bigger, and again, everything looks the same. So no map, it's hard to figure out where you're going. Kind of feel like a broken record at this point, but the whaling ship is pretty fun and cool, and then the game takes a bit of a nosedive once you get onto this facility. I'm honestly a bit surprised I got through this without too much hassle, because looking back at the footage, it looks a lot like The Thing on Xbox, which I was trying to play, and I just found it so boring and so monotonous that I dropped it for the time being. I think this game kind of airs more on like the monotonous and crappy side of budget, rather than like Vampire Reign's funny side. So there's not really a whole lot of entertaining stuff here. The most obvious change is just add a map. It would remove a lot of the guesswork and make backtracking a lot easier and a lot faster. There's really no excuse for not having a map in a game like this. A basic inventory would be nice, even if just to carry like a med pack. I found a few parts difficult because I was low on health, and having to rely on a random drop for ammo or health was pretty annoying. The final boss needed to just straight up be something better. Doesn't sit well with me the way the game ended. Even if it was just a traditional shoot it until it dies, it would have been a lot better of an experience overall. Like I said, I'm kind of indifferent to Cold Fear. It's hard to think of stuff that would be better. I genuinely feel bad for Darkworks because Cold Fear was just totally eclipsed by Resident Evil 4's release 2 months earlier. Resident Evil 4 just destroys Cold Fear in every aspect. I don't have very strong feelings about it otherwise, honestly. To me, it feels like a budget title, but it does some cool things that might be interesting to some people. If the whole game took place on a ship, and you had to keep using these mechanics that they developed, I think it would be a lot easier to recommend it, but it just kind of nosedives at the end. Check it out on Steam if you're interested. Otherwise, just play Resident Evil 4, because Resident Evil 4 is an amazing game.